You didn't become an option because you weren't enough. You became one because you were always available. Every time they pulled back, you leaned in. Every time they disappeared, you waited. And the moment you stopped being so accessible, something shifted, not in you, in them. Today, you'll understand why an avoidant values you more when you're slightly out of reach, and why constant availability quietly kills attraction. Most people never understand the mechanism underneath these questions. They keep adjusting their behavior on the surface, being more patient, more understanding, more present, without ever touching the structural reality that's producing the dynamic they're trapped in. By the end of this, you're going to understand this single psychological shift that moves you from option to obsession in an avoidance internal world. Not through games, not through manipulation, through a fundamental change in how you relate to your own value and what you will and will not make available to someone who hasn't earned it. If this kind of thinking cuts through the noise for you, subscribe. This is the channel for people who are ready to operate differently. Here is the reframe that restructures everything. You've been operating under the assumption that more availability creates more attraction. That showing up consistently, being emotionally generous, demonstrating reliability, all of that would eventually be recognized and reciprocated. That assumption is not wrong in a healthy dynamic, but an avoidant dynamic is not a healthy dynamic. And applying healthy relationship logic to an avoidant attachment structure produces the exact opposite of what you intend. Here is the mechanism you need to understand. An avoidance desire is inversely correlated with accessibility. This is not a personality quirk. It is a structural feature of how their attachment system was conditioned. Avoidance learned early that closeness was threatening, that emotional dependency led to disappointment, engulfment, or loss of self. So their nervous system built a specific response pattern. The more available something is, the less psychological urgency it generates. The more uncertain the access, the more cognitive and emotional resources get allocated toward it. This means that your consistent availability, the thing you offered as proof of your value, has been registering in their system as the absence of challenge, as something that requires no effort to maintain. And things that require no effort to maintain do not produce the neurological signature of desire. They produce the neurological signature of comfort, which in an avoidance world is indistinguishable from stagnation. Being an option is not about how they see you. It's about how the dynamic has been structured. And the structure can be changed. Not by withdrawing emotionally as a tactic, but by genuinely restructuring what you make available, to whom, and under what conditions. That restructuring begins with one shift. You stop organizing your behavior around their inconsistency and start organizing it around your own standard. Here is how the dynamic moves through phases when that shift is made. The first phase is the comfort assumption. This is the phase you're currently in or have been in. The avoidant operates with a background assumption that you'll be there, available, accommodating, emotionally open, regardless of how they show up. They don't consciously think this. It's not a deliberate calculation. It's simply the baseline the dynamic has established. Externally, they're inconsistent, periodically warm, often distant. Internally, they're not expending any real psychological energy on you because the outcome, your availability, is assumed. You are, in the most precise sense, a settled variable in their equation. The second phase is the standard disruption. This phase begins the moment your behavior stops confirming the comfort assumption. You don't announce it. You don't explain it. You simply stop being as available as you were. You respond slower. You have plans when they reach out. You're present, but not hovering. Externally, the avoidant notices, and their initial response is often irritation or casual testing. They reach out in the way that used to produce immediate warmth, and the response is different, cooler, less urgent. Internally, something shifts in their cognitive architecture. The settled variable is no longer settled, and a nervous system that has grown accustomed to guaranteed access suddenly has to recalibrate. The third phase is the involuntary attention spike. This is where the psychology becomes particularly precise. When access to something previously guaranteed becomes uncertain, the brain doesn't respond with indifference. It responds with increased allocation of attention. The avoidant begins thinking about you more, not because they've had an emotional breakthrough, but because their system has registered an anomaly. Something changed. The pattern broke. And the brain is designed to resolve pattern disruption by directing attention toward the source. Externally, you may notice more frequent contact, not necessarily more vulnerable or open, but more frequent. More checking in, more casual reach-outs that are designed to test whether the old dynamic is still accessible. Internally, what they're experiencing is the early stage of genuine investment. Involuntary, uncomfortable, unfamiliar. The fourth phase is the scarcity revaluation. The avoidance internal assessment of you begins to shift. What was previously categorized as available resource is now being processed as uncertain quantity, and uncertain quantities produce a specific psychological response, elevated perceived value. This is not manipulation producing a false outcome. This is the avoidance assessment system finally having accurate data to work with. The actual scarcity of someone who has standards, a full life, and is not structurally organized around the avoidance comfort. Their desire becomes less passive and more active, less comfortable and more urgent. The dynamic, for the first time, has real tension, and real tension is the only environment in which an avoidance attachment system will actually engage. The fifth phase is the selective availability lock-in. If you've maintained the standard through the previous phases, not as a performance, but as a genuine restructuring of how you operate, the avoidant reaches a point of psychological lock-in. You have become the thing their system has no efficient protocol for, someone they cannot fully predict, cannot fully access, and cannot categorize as a guaranteed option. Their cognitive and emotional resources begin to orient toward you in a way that resembles, structurally, what most people call addiction. Not because you played a game, because you stopped being easy to take for granted and started being genuinely worth pursuing. Here is the contrast that separates the people who shift the dynamic from the ones who stay trapped in it. Most people, when they realize they've become an option, respond by doing more. More communication about their feelings. More demonstrations of loyalty. More patience extended toward behavior that doesn't merit it. The internal logic is, if I show them how much I care, they'll start caring equally. What actually happens is the opposite. More emotional output from you confirms the comfort assumption. It tells the avoidance nervous system that the option is still fully available, and perhaps even more available now. Because you're visibly trying, the dynamic doesn't shift. It calcifies. What actually creates this shift is not doing more. It's doing differently. Specifically, it's restructuring the internal premise from which you're operating. The people who successfully move from option to priority in an avoidance world are not the ones who became more strategically unavailable. They are the ones who genuinely stopped making the avoidant the organizing principle of their emotional life. They built things. They pursued their own development. They made decisions based on what they wanted, not on what would produce a specific response. That internal reorientation changes the texture of every interaction, every response, every moment of contact. And an avoidance system, finely tuned to detect emotional need, detects the absence of it immediately. 5 principles that execute this shift at the behavioral level. The first is standard anchoring. Before any behavioral change is possible, you need a clearly defined internal standard, not for them, for yourself. What kind of dynamic do you actually want? What level of consistency do you require? What behaviors are outside the boundary of what you'll organize your life around? These standards, once internalized, produce automatic behavioral shifts. You stop responding to inconsistency with accommodation because your standard doesn't have room for it. The second is selective presence. Stop being omnipresent. Not to create scarcity artificially, but because your presence should be something that reflects genuine engagement, not anxious availability. When you are present, be fully present. When you're not, be genuinely not. The contrast between engaged presence and real absence is far more powerful than the static hum of constant availability. The third is investment redistribution. Take the emotional, mental, and temporal investment you've been directing toward this dynamic and redistribute it with intention. Your work, your body, your other relationships, your creative output. This redistribution does 2 things simultaneously. It builds genuine value in your own life, and it removes the cognitive bandwidth that was keeping the avoidant at the center of your psychological universe. You become less available because you genuinely have more to attend to. That is the only kind of unavailability that registers as real. The fourth is response architecture. How you respond to their contact matters more than whether you respond. A response that communicates ease, groundedness, and mild interest is more destabilizing to an avoidance comfort assumption than ignoring them entirely. You're not cold. You're not punishing. You're simply responding from a place that doesn't communicate urgency. That absence of urgency is what their system reads as genuine confidence, and genuine confidence is the single quality most likely to hold an avoidant's sustained attention. The fifth is outcome decoupling. Separate your behavioral choices from their outcomes. You set your standard not because it will make them pursue you, but because it reflects what you actually require. You redistribute your investment not to trigger their interest, but because your life deserves that investment. When your behavior is decoupled from the outcome of their response, you stop performing and start operating. That distinction is immediately legible to an avoidant. Performed confidence collapses under pressure. Real self-possession doesn't. Here is where the tactical becomes transformational. Every principle above is useful. But if you apply them as techniques to become less of an option, you've missed the deeper work. Because the real question isn't how to make an avoidant addicted to you. The real question is why being an option was tolerable for as long as it was. You don't react to their inconsistency. You set a standard that makes inconsistency incompatible with access to your presence. You don't become unavailable to create desire. You become genuinely invested in your own life, which naturally produces unavailability as a byproduct. You don't perform confidence to shift the dynamic. You build it, slowly, through decisions made in alignment with your own value, until it stops being a performance entirely. You don't seek to become their priority. You become someone for whom being an option is no longer an acceptable arrangement. That last one is the shift. Everything else follows from it. Here is the perspective that ties all of this together. At the deepest level, the reason you became an option is not because you weren't valuable enough. It's because you were willing to be one. Somewhere, at some point, you decided that partial access to this person was worth more than full access to your own standards. That there, inconsistent warmth was preferable to the uncertainty of walking away and finding something more complete. That decision was understandable. It is also the most expensive decision you made in this dynamic. The shift available to you now is not a strategy, it is a correction. A realignment between what you know you deserve and how you've been allowing yourself to be treated. When that alignment is restored, not performed, restored, the dynamic changes. Because the person you become when you're operating in alignment with your actual value is not someone an avoidant can comfortably take for granted. They can take a version of you that's organized around their availability. They cannot take for granted a version of you that's organized around your own. So the only question worth answering right now is this: which version of you is showing up tomorrow?